In order to write great comedy, one must have suffered through great tragedy. Every joke contains a truth hard won from pain. Laughter is bought at the price of trauma. And perhaps nothing expresses this understanding better than the two masks that symbolise the theatre. One mask is raucously laughing, the other is grimacing in despair, and they come in a pair to denote the two major forms of drama, comedy and tragedy. And the theatre world, for much of history, has treated these genres as binaries. Yes, you have tragicomedy. Yes, you have trailblazing, revolutionary playwrights who bend and blend and subvert generic expectations. But ultimately, comedy and tragedy have different rules. They have different aims, and audiences have significantly different expectations going into each. And yet these two genres are not as mutually exclusive as they might initially seem. And it is very often the case that the one who wears the laughing mask is secretly crying, secretly despairing underneath. And few knew this as well as 17th century French comic playwright and actor Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, although you may recognise him more readily from his pen name and stage name, Molière. Molière is one of the fathers, one of the titans of French literature, and in fact the very same way that lovers of literature refer to the English language as the language of Shakespeare, the Spanish language as the language of Cervantes, German as the language of Goethe, the French language itself is la langue de Molière. Today the plays of Molière are performed more often than those of any other artist at the Commedia française, and he is rightly revered as a comic genius. But if we could time travel, and if we could be a fly on the wall of his abode at Auteuil in the year of 1669, we would see a picture of tragedy. We'd find a man in his late 40s who only had a few more years left to live before the tuberculosis that was plaguing him would finish him off. We would find a man who, having brought box office smash hit after smash hit to the theatres of Paris, was now in hiding from the public, in hiding from Parisian high society, and in very bad shape. Jean-Baptiste had endured years of being viciously attacked by the critics. He had his satirical social comedies of manners banned for being deeply offensive and dangerous to society. He would fight relentlessly to get his banned plays back on stage, and high-ranking church officials would petition the king, King Louis XIV, to not only kill off his plays, but to kill the man too. After all of this, Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, or Molière, would be racked with nasty coughing fits. He would experience extreme levels of fatigue, extreme depression, and after years of taking vitriolic and jealous attacks into him, he would develop a very severe and understandable case of misanthropy. Molière makes me laugh like few other writers can, and yet I'm all too aware that that laughter comes from a place of pain. The characters of Molière's plays demonstrate that the writer had a very deep understanding of the human condition, and the works that caused controversy just under 4 centuries ago continue to be deeply informative, relevant and funny today. And because I would love to see more discussion of Molière in the English-speaking world, there is of course an abundance of performance analysis and appreciation in the French-speaking world, but in the Anglosphere, whilst you may be fortunate to find performances of plays like Tartuffe, the Misanthrope, or the Learned Ladies here and there, now and then, I strongly believe that Molière is woefully underserved in the English-speaking world, and I would love to remedy that by getting a discussion about Molière going today. And because we are now kicking off an exciting new read-through for the plays of Molière at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature, I would love to talk to you about how you can appreciate this phenomenal dramatist by introducing the socio-historical and theatrical context of his age. To understand what makes a playwright's works controversial and revolutionary, we have to understand what was the norm. If you see the norm, you can appreciate the deviation. If you can understand the culture, then you can appreciate the satire of that culture. And it's very much worth bearing in mind that the history of French theatre contains within it the social and political history of the country. The development of the country can be charted and observed in the plays and performances. Jean-Baptiste Poquelin was born in a France where the acting profession was far from respected. In fact, in his lifetime, actors weren't allowed to be buried in sacred ground. They were excommunicated by the Holy Roman Church. And during the time of the French Renaissance, we see that theatre undergoes a significant evolution. It goes from being medieval and church-driven, linked with religious factions and guilds, celebrating festivals in the Christian calendar, think mystery plays and morality plays and religious pageants. It goes from that to steadily becoming a supremely organised and sophisticated extension of the absolute rule of King Louis XIV. He ruled for 72 years. That's the longest rule of any monarch. And Louis sought to make Paris, under his rule, into what Athens and Rome had been in their golden eras. Thanks to Louis XIV, or the Sun King, thanks to his love of extravagant performances over the course of Jean-Baptiste's life, the public's attitude towards acting and the theatre did indeed change and become more favourable. Despite that, however, it was still quite a thing for a young man who was born into a relatively wealthy bourgeois family. Indeed, his father was the king's upholsterer. It was quite a thing for this young man, Jean-Baptiste, to say he was going into acting, not just playwriting. He wanted to be on stage himself. He wanted to be before an audience. Now, his family, his father, we think, actually had to bail him out of prison at the age of 21 because after creating his own theatre company, the Illustre Théâtre, with the famous Béjart family, one of whom, Armande, he actually married after having had a relationship with her mother. After creating his own theatre company, he fell into debt, so he was thrown into debtor's prison, and I'm pretty sure that his father needing to bail him out didn't do much to solidify the family's opinion of the acting profession. Little did they know that Jean-Baptiste would go on to be one of the titans of French literature. Now, Jean-Baptiste was bitten by the performance bug when he was just a young boy, when his grandfather took him to see the Italian shows. These shows were filled with acrobatics and pantomime and farce and lots of slapstick humour, and it quickly became clear that Jean-Baptiste had a talent, a real inborn, innate talent and instinct for comedy, facial contortion, comic timing, visual gags, farcical situational humour. Jean-Baptiste very quickly became a master of all of this. And yet for the longest time he actually yearned to write tragedies, and those were pretty much the two choices open to playwrights at the time, comedy or tragedy, and it must have felt as though the world of playmaking was quite rigidly set. In the century prior to Jean-Baptiste's life, plays were largely religious mystery plays, but in 1548 these were totally banned because Protestants and Catholics alike thought them to be disrespectful to the subject matter, and so we see a decree from the Parlement de Paris putting an official prohibition on performances that represented the sacred mysteries, like the Passion of Christ. And then in the very next year, in 1549, we see a very important manifesto called the Defense and Illustration of the French Language, penned by Joachim de Bellay, who founded and was part of a group of poets called La Pléiade. And this manifesto called for a campaign to establish French literature as one of central importance in Europe. In regards to dramatic writing, this called for replacing those now banned mystery plays with two clear delineations: comedy and tragedy, as per the prestigious and authoritative ancient writers. Now, over the course of the second half of the 16th century, we see playwrights following this manifesto start producing producing a significant amount of plays, particularly tragedies, plays that were heavy reworkings of the ancients, plays from Roman writers like Plautus, Seneca, Terence, tragedies from writers like Sophocles, and many of these plays would also be indebted to the more contemporary and popular Italian tradition of theatre. These newly produced plays, the ones derivative of the ancients, they were almost exclusively the work of scholars writing for royal performance at court, and they would have aristocratic patrons, and they would put on these plays in private houses and at colleges. The term neoclassical wouldn't be coined until much later, but that's what these works were. Now, what we see happens is strong generic delineations are drawn up, and it was thought that one couldn't mix comedy and tragedy. You had to pick one. And we see that the form of tragedy is a play divided into 5 acts in verse of rhyming alexandrine. The alexandrine, which is a line comprised of 12 syllables, is the leading measure of French poetry. And there's a beautiful sense of balance in the metrics of French poetry. Alexandrines sound stately and elegant. There's a balance because wordsmiths will put the predominant stress right in the middle of the line on the 6th syllable, and then they'll put a caesura, a pause in the middle of the line, and then they'll put another stress, another strong stress at the very end of the line. Now, French literature has the tragedian Pierre Corneille to thank for solidifying the formula for tragic verse. And when we think of great French playwrights, we think Corneille, tragedy, we think Racine, tragedy, and we think Molière, comedy. And Molière learnt a lot from Corneille directly. He respected him. But Corneille would come under scorn when he tried to transgress against or flout the classical conventions of the unities in a play called Le Cid, which prompted Molière to say essentially, who cares whether the ancient conventions were met or not? A play is either well written or isn't, and this one certainly is. Now, indeed, Corneille's Le Cid was so popular in 1637 that the theatre actually made more room for the spectators on stage. So you would have some audience members right up close to the actors sharing that same space, and this practice continued for around a century, and they would put a really high price on these seats, and these seats made the theatre a lot of money. So when you went to the theatre, you'd have to put up with looking at members of the titled class on stage whilst looking at the actors at the same time. It was thought at the time that a play had to rigidly adhere to the classical unities of action, time, and place. Unity of action means that the play should only have one action or central storyline with few or no subplots. Unity of time means that the action should occur in just one day over the course of 24 hours. And unity of place means that the action should be limited to a single location. Over in England, Shakespeare famously couldn't be contained by the unities. Now, some of Shakespeare's plays demonstrate that he could adhere to the unities, whilst many others, like Antony and Cleopatra for example, overspilled so thoroughly and attracted a lot of criticism for not adhering to the confines of being about one thing in one day in the same place. Indeed, John Dryden tried to rewrite Antony and Cleopatra so as to make it adhere to the unities, and though I do love Dryden, I don't think it comes close to comparing with Shakespeare. It definitely doesn't better it. Now, all of this sounds very restrictive, doesn't it? And to a degree it is, but there's also something to be said about having a framework. A framework and guidelines can be very valuable. It can be really exciting to see a writer pushing up against the rules and confines and daring within a formula. Many playwrights really weren't resigning themselves to writing like this, secretly wishing for something more free form. They liked working to this order and considered this to be refinement. Following the rules in many playwrights' eyes would make their plays sophisticated, and if an audience could appreciate this, it would speak to their refinement, the audience's sophistication. But of course, the very greatest playwrights also wanted the freedom to defy these conventions and constrictions. And anytime they did, they came up against a lot of scorn. Now, in addition to the classical unities, in addition to the 5-act structure and the rule about not mixing dramatic forms, comedies are comedies, tragedies are tragedies, the Académie Française established several rules for plays. Plays needed to have verisimilitude, which means that the action had to be believable, and that meant no soliloquies, where an actor is delivering a monologue to the audience, because of course that breaks the fourth wall. Many playwrights would get around this by having these speeches delivered to servant characters instead. Another rule was that drama had to have decorum and needed to uphold and teach French morals. There was no defamation of real people allowed, and the characters, if they were good, had to be rewarded. If they were bad, they had to be punished. And there was also a restriction on violence. You weren't supposed to show extreme violence because that's uncouth and vulgar. Now, there were also expectations of the kinds of stories you would get when you go into a comedy or you go into a tragedy. The subject matter differed quite drastically. For tragedy, the subject matter was taken from mythology, ancient history, sometimes more recent history, the Bible, or the lives of the saints. And tragedies were highly rhetorical, where the actors would display their great oratorical power. You would get wailing lamentations filling the theatre when a tragedy was being performed. And it was the upper classes that were depicted in tragic plays. Now, comedies were light entertainment, they were humorous, energetic, they were bawdy, and they were aimed at and about the middle and lower classes. Comedy, the term, referred to the subject matter and the narrative arc, particularly the ending. Comedies were about love, and they had a happy ending. Now, tragicomedy, which would be a serious play with a happy ending, was popular for a short while, but that subsided because, of course, mixing the genres wasn't the done thing, and tragedy would become the favourite in the theatres. That was the most popular genre. And I say all this to stress the fact that there were two clear delineations carved out, and you either worked in tragedy or comedy. Shakespeare would be the exception not only in English, but in the tradition of theatre generally, when it came to being a playwright who worked influentially in both. Now, in addition to being influenced by the ancients and traditional French farce, comedy was also significantly influenced by the Italian dramatists of the Commedia dell'arte, an Italian troupe under Tiberio Fiorilli, more commonly known by the character he portrayed, Scaramouche. This Italian troupe was a permanent institution in France in the 17th century, and Commedia dell'arte was incredibly popular throughout Europe from the 16th to the 18th century. These performances involved acrobatics, farce, and improvisation based on scenarios with characters who were stock types. Classic farcical stories that audiences loved included stories about cuckolded husbands, or husbands who think they're cuckolds. There were stories about jealous lovers, jealous husbands. For some reason, cuckoldry has long been a staple in the comic tradition. Now, Molière learnt a lot from Scaramouche, and he modelled his acting on him, as he would share the same theatre space with his company. For the stock characters and masked types, you would get devious servants, you'd get military braggarts, you'd get foolish old men, and there would be improvisational comedy based on sketches or scenarios involving these figures. Often, the entrance and exit only was scripted in, the entrance of the character, but everything else would be improvisation based on their type. For a modern day parallel, I'm reminded of the television show Curb Your Enthusiasm with Larry David. The characters that our central protagonist, Larry, encounters are very often types. They have one thing that is preoccupying them. They have one thing that kind of defines them. Our central protagonist comes up against these types, and the hilarity is improvisational, because indeed for Curb, they would just sketch out roughly how they want the scene to go, and they would let the actors have free rein when it came to actually performing it. The comedy, of course, arises from the fact that we identify with Larry, who's being put in absurd situations, and when he points out the absurdity of the world, he gets pushback. Now, the masks of Italian comedy were sketches of general characteristics, and originally these characters were made distinct by virtue of what Italian locale they originated from. So, Pantaloon, for example, was a merchant from Venice. Harlequin was a peasant from Bergamo. Scaramouche was a Neapolitan adventurer. However, when these plays came to France, the location details were ignored or went unnoticed. So Scaramouche is taken in more general terms as a rogue. Harlequin is taken in more general terms as a naive valet or servant. We see Pantaloon is a general character, a miserly, melancholy old man. And there are so many types that everyone in society would have recognised. The doctor type was a pedant of philosophy. Now, you had two types of comedy. You had high comedy, which was often mimetic, and that had the aim of eliciting intellectual laughter through witty dialogue, wordplay, and social satire. And then you had low comedy, which was ludic. That was about gross distortions and exaggerations of reality, designed to elicit belly laughs through slapstick, farce, visual gags, buffoonery, and bawdy subject matter. What Molière does over the course of his career, as he develops and starts to pen his masterpieces, is he takes classic French and Italian farce, he shuttles it into a 5-act verse structure, and then he composes mimetic comedies that blend the high and the low. And in so doing, he sought to make the upper classes laugh the way that those in the provinces would laugh at farce. And he did this with plays that were set in the contemporary French world, reflecting life that the audience would have recognised. And he populates his plays with character types that are and also kind of aren't just types. We see over the course of his career the masks of the Commedia dell'arte start to melt away. Now today, we might see Molière's plays, even his great ones, as still revolving around character types, and we would be right, they do. We might also say that his plays don't have strong plots, and that would be true too, but that's not really the point. The plot in these comedies is a thin pretext to simply stitch together comic action, to get funny caricatures of people together being ridiculous for our entertainment. We might say that Molière's characters remain the same from start to finish. They're unchanged from beginning to end. They are what they are. They do not convert, repent, morph, or develop. But that's an unfair expectation. We've come to expect our characters to have the psychological complexity of Shakespeare's round protagonists, to use a term from E.M. Forster. But that's only one type of drama, and that's not what every dramatist is trying to do. Though, of course, lovers of Molière will quite rightly point to a character like Alceste from Les Misanthropes as an example of a complex character. Alceste, like Hamlet, is a role of a lifetime, and actors will spend years preparing for this role. Because Alceste is complicated, he does have psychological complexity. But generally speaking, we shouldn't expect that Shakespearean or Whitmanian I contain multitudes, I contradict myself complexity when we come to Molière's plays. That shouldn't be the demand, because that's not what he is striving after. And when we embrace and understand the tradition within which he is working, we will see that Molière's characters are no less innovative, vitalistic, and genius than Shakespeare's. Molière's characters are larger-than-life cartoons, but they also contain enduring truths about the human condition. In his characters, we see some aspects of us, of ourselves. We don't see a complete picture. Indeed, we hope that his characters aren't completely us, but we recognise the element that has become that character's entire persona. For Molière's characters, there is always some passion, some singular ruling vice, some force that takes them over completely. So, one character might be lust, personified, and everything they do is driven by that passion, whilst another character might be misanthropy personified. Another character might be a complete and total hypochondriac, whilst another character is just pure jealousy, envy personified. There are many characters like that. There are many characters who are a personification of literary pretension. Molière's characters are also often significantly delusional, and they have their souls taken over by one extreme emotion or desire that totally directs their behaviour. And I think it can be very liberating to see some aspect of ourselves blown up and exaggerated on stage for comic effect. It's quite a liberating viewing experience. And not only that, but Molière's greatest characters and his most vitalistic characters are satirists, just like their creator, their writer. In fact, his greatest characters are manifestations of Molière himself, and that means we, the audience, likely sympathise with them or identify with them too, especially when they are making critical comments about the time and about the people of the time. Interestingly, however, as I've said, Molière gives us characters that kind of are real people and their types simultaneously. His best characters aren't just gross distortions, they're relatable, and this would cause a lot of confusion for audiences, especially during the mature phase of his career, because audiences didn't know whether they should be laughing at them, laughing at the characters, or relating to them, sympathising with them, seeing some aspect of themselves or the people that they knew, because typically your characters had to be one or the other. For Molière, however, why couldn't they be both? Why couldn't you laugh at a ridiculous caricature, but also see an aspect of yourself or your neighbours? And this was absolutely groundbreaking at the time, when Molière shuffled together elements of the dramatic tradition that traditionally had no business being put together. The result is alchemy, and he turns these once disparate elements into something magical. Molière is often compared to Shakespeare, and if you know me, you know I have a very deep love of Shakespeare. I am a bardolater through and through. He's often compared to Shakespeare, but it's important to understand that this arises from people trying to impress his genius upon English speakers who don't know much about him, who don't know his plays yet. In style, he's not like Shakespeare at all. He's actually much closer to Ben Jonson than Shakespeare, because both inherited their plays from the Roman playwrights Plautus and Terence. Both are working with stock types, and both of them are more tightly plotted than Shakespeare. But when it comes to genius, yes, Molière and Shakespeare absolutely are comparable. Molière's writing was innovative, it was revolutionary, and he achieved enormous box office success, but he also provoked an intense amount of scorn. In order to appreciate what he is doing in his plays, we must understand something of his time and his career, and we must know something of King Louis XIV, because as chaos rained down upon Molière from those disgruntled and outraged about his plays, it was the king's favour that offered him protection. For years, as a young man, Jean-Baptiste would tour the countryside provinces with his troupe. They'd take their farces on the road. They'd throw their props and their costumes on the back of a wagon, and they would travel from town to town. Now, it took Jean-Baptiste a while to break into the inner circles of Parisian high society, and when he did, he wasn't exactly accepted. But we could also say that it took a while for a sense of stability to reign over high society. Jean-Baptiste was travelling through a country that was torn apart, because in the early 17th century, France was a very tumultuous place to be. After the death of Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, who were the de facto rulers of France, after they died in the early 1640s, a series of anti-government civil wars known as the Fronde, which lasted half a decade, were raging right in the midst of France's war with Spain. So you have domestic violence and civil strife and international conflict at the same time. And Louis XIV was a very young king when all of this was taking place. He was actually just 4 years old when he came to the throne. And as he got older, as he went through his adolescence and young adulthood, the king would come up against a lot of opposition from the nobility, from the law courts, the Parlement, from the princes. Along with the French population as well, they were all resisting the king's government's edicts and questioning the constitutionality of his powers and trying to put him in check. To say that there was a power struggle going on at this time would be a gross understatement. And so what Louis did was he set up a strict hierarchy at the Palace of Versailles, where one's social position was contingent upon whether you were in the king's favour or not. We see the emergence of the absolute monarchy with Louis XIV. Now, the foundation for absolutism had already been laid before him, but he secured it, and he took power away from the nobles, and he made it so that all decisions had to be run by him. And he did all of this at just the tender age of 23. The king would steadily become the one who could make or break you. Louis is famous for having high-ranking courtiers and those close to him do menial things, like helping him to get dressed in the morning. He would have a dozen or so courtiers in his bedchamber of a morning, and one courtier would help him with one pantaloon leg, maybe another courtier would help him with the other, those sorts of menial tasks. Now, of course, this wasn't actually menial, this was actually seen as a great privilege, helping he who has the divine right to rule in so intimate a matter would speak to your importance. And you wanted to be there in Louis's inner circle, because if you were in that inner circle, you had the king's ear. But you had to tread very carefully, because you could be in favour one day and then fall out of favour the next. There's a really great documentary that goes into this with Lucy Worsley, which is worth checking out, about the Palace of Versailles. And you might think that this sounds rather ludicrous today, but this sort of rule was absolutely necessary to keep harmony in a country that had been ripped apart by vicious strife and lots of different disparate factions grabbing for power. For the courtiers helping the Sun King in the royal bedchamber, the message was loud and clear. You're not ruling anything. You defer to me. Louis never forgot what the nobles had been like during the Fronde, and so he kept them in check his entire life. And so when the king fell in love with the plays of Molière, it didn't really matter that the nobles had problems with these plays, because Louis wasn't their biggest fan either, though royal protection couldn't always stop the outraged mobs in the upper echelons having their way and banning his plays. Now, the royal favour for Molière began when he was able to secure a performance for the king's only brother, Philippe d'Orléans, the Duke of Orléans, and he became patron of their company, and he lent his name to their troupe. They became the players of Monsieur, the king's only brother. This was in the late 1650s, and up until that point, Molière, who had great entrepreneurial spirit, would scribble furiously throughout the night. His days were filled with energetic performances, and then he'd stay up into the night writing furiously. He'd start writing his own one-act farces inspired by the Italian plays, and he was very popular. But the critics were out for him pretty much from the start, and they would call him a plagiarist, they would call him derivative, in the wake of box office smash hit and acclaim. And so many of the attacks launched at Jean-Baptiste were clearly fueled by jealousy. His detractors said that he stole extensively from stories already in the common stock. Of course, that same criticism could be levelled against pretty much any artist of genius. If we think again of Shakespeare, for example, we can see that same criticism could and indeed has been said about him. That's a bit of a ludicrous charge, however, because all art is derivative. It is a response to what came before. The genius, or the art, lies in what you do with it, what you do with the common stock. And also, there wasn't always evidence of where exactly he had stolen his plays from. Yes, he had extensive knowledge of Spanish, Italian and French drama, and he was inspired by those characters and plot lines. But we could say what works weren't at the time. The jealous husband type and stories of imagined cuckoldry and the shenanigans that ensue. This is not something that any one writer would have a monopoly on. These are old stories that we've been telling over and over again since the dawn of art, practically. But we can see that Molière, yes, he was inspired by these old stories, but he was also very keen to differentiate himself, and he had to put his dreams of becoming a tragedian aside after performing in the role of Caesar. He played the role of Caesar and was met with utter disdain. But when he came on stage in the comic guise of the role of Sganarelle in a play called The Imaginary Cuckold, and this character is a stock caricature of a jealous husband who imagines his wife is cheating on him. When he came on stage as Sganarelle, the audience roared with laughter and broke into a standing ovation. Now Molière would wonder, what's wrong with the audience? Do they not like tragedies? Have the plays of Corneille, for example, fallen out of favour? Now, he came to the painful realisation that the audience actually didn't have a problem with tragedy. They still loved tragedy, they just didn't like him performing tragedy because he wasn't very good at it. Where he excelled was in comedy, and this character of Sganarelle was so popular that he would recycle and reuse him across half a dozen plays. Despite audiences roaring with laughter, the character of Sganarelle also caused public outrage. The thing is, the reason why Molière was so good at writing jealous husbands is because this was the exact thing he suffered from in his marriage. Jealousy. Molière knew this part of the human condition so well because he had suffered from it. So when Molière ridiculed jealous husbands and then played them himself, sure, we can say he was critiquing other people, he was satirising other people, people that he knew and saw in his day-to-day life, but the fact of the matter is, knowledge of others is actually self-knowledge. And this was something that another father of French literature, Michel de Montaigne, knew very well. And at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, as part of our Foundational Thinkers series, at time of recording we've just done Machiavelli's The Prince, and that lecture is still available on demand at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Our next foundational thinker, our next deep dive, will be exploring the essays of Montaigne. The interesting thing about Montaigne is that Molière and Shakespeare are significantly different from each other, and Molière is not influenced by Shakespeare in a world where so many are, and yet they have a common ancestor in the form of Montaigne, because Shakespeare read Montaigne and Molière read Montaigne. As we slide into spring, it's going to be a very exciting season at the book club because we're going to be reading some really complementary works. We're reading Shakespeare, Molière, Montaigne, and Jane Austen. So Molière was good at depicting jealous husbands because that's what he was, but the audience still saw a manifestation of themselves. And Molière would say, you've achieved nothing if you don't get the people of today to recognise themselves. One member of the bourgeois in the audience, when he saw Sganarelle, the imaginary cuckold, on stage, actually cried out in a rage that that monster Molière had used him for his model and he was being portrayed on stage. Now, of course, Molière didn't actually know this particular man, and if many more in the audience felt as though they were being lampooned on stage, they actually had the good sense to not mention it. They were keen to keep that quiet. Despite Molière's dream of performing tragedy, it ultimately didn't matter that comedy was thrust upon him. It didn't matter that he was a comic genius and that's where his gifts were, because Molière found freedom on the stage. Comedy, tragedy, it didn't matter. Performing on stage liberated him. The stage was his residence. That's where he felt he could really be who he was and express himself. And that's why it was so painful when he would be banned and censored. And I really love what Jacques Guichanon would say about this, about Molière. He would say, although despondent as a man, Molière was not despondent as a playwright. By means of the theatre, that higher game, he achieved a state of joy. Comedy is probably the only solution for pessimists, for without denying the horror of the human condition, comedy absorbs it to provoke laughter about an illusion that is frankly an illusion. Though unhappy as a man, Molière attained freedom for the couple of hours he could be on stage in a comic alternate reality of his own creation. With sponsorship from the king's brother, Molière's troupe would perform at the Louvre and at the Théâtre du Petit Bourbon, in front of the highest class of audience you could get: Cardinal Mazarin, Anne of Austria, and King Louis XIV himself. In addition to Sganarelle having the king himself in fits of laughter, there was also a play that tickled him very much, called Les Précieuses ridicules, or The Precious Ladies Ridiculed. Despite making the king laugh, however, this play caused outrage, something that was a common theme throughout Molière's life. This one-act comedy of manners was Molière taking aim at the witty, oh-so-cultured and refined ladies of high society, the pretentious types, who looked down on his plays as vulgar. It's important to understand that Molière's age was the age of the salon, the age of préciosité, or preciousness. Preciousness was a 17th century literary and cultural movement that Molière clearly was not fond of. At this time, the voluminous novels of Madeleine de Scudéry were taking refined society by storm. Scudéry created the roman à clef, a type of novel about real-life events that have a fictional facade laid over them. So you have real people in the novel given fictitious names so that writers can spill the gossip about scandalous events without being considered libelous. Writers like Madeleine de Scudéry and famous marquises, coteries of Précieuses, comprised of the wittiest men and women of fashion, would gather in salons to discuss feminine elegance, etiquette, and courtly love. Now, of course, these salons were frequently just gossip chambers, little elitist in-groups that put on a lot of literary pretension. We see in Molière's plays one of the most frequent recurring storylines involves someone of these precious circles writing terrible courtly love poems that everyone falls over themselves to flatter. And yet the humour arises for us in how glaringly obvious it is these poems lack any literary merit whatsoever, and the hilarity ensues from the observation of the hypocrisy of high society. Molière's Les Précieuses ridicules was about the kinds of ladies whose heads were stuffed with the novels of Madeleine de Scudéry, and we see in this play two women rejecting their suitors because the men don't meet their levels of refinement. And so the suitors take their revenge on the precious ladies by dressing up their valets as marquises. A staple of farcical comedy is the disguised servant, and the ladies warmly receive these servants because of their titles. We see that these dressed up servants captivate the ladies with fabricated tales of their sophistication, their gentility, and one, Mascarille, played by Molière, regales them with a poem of his own composition that goes like this. Oh, oh, I contemplated here, completely off my guard, with nothing else about or near, it quickly hit me hard. Your eye, so sly, I did espy, with speed beyond belief. You stole my heart, and now I cry, stop thief, stop thief, stop thief. This poem is clearly a ridiculous lampooning of the kinds of awful poems that the affected and pretentious put forward and lauded with serious faces. And if you find a great actor saying these lines, this is very, very funny. Molière was destroying these salons of refinement and the people who comprised them, and this caused outrage and indignation. But Molière was trying to get away with it because he could say that he wasn't making fun of actual marquises, he was making fun of the servants who were dressing up as the marquises, but we know that this wasn't the case. We know who he was really making fun of. Molière mocked everything these people of culture held dear, the manners and customs of contemporary Paris, and he did so right to their faces because they were in the audience, and so they had to feel the sting of embarrassment as the audience roared with laughter. The very next day, after this performance, Molière received a notice from the Paris authorities banning all further productions of The Precious Ladies Ridiculed, outraged condemnation ran through these groups, and he was the talk of the salons, not in a good way. Not only was Monsieur Molière offensive, they said, but he was also a plagiarist of the old farces, which makes one wonder, why would you be so outraged then? If he's simply recycling old stories, he can't be talking about you. That's the thing. These old stories contain eternal themes, that's why they are always contemporary. Molière was very fortunate to have the king's favour. Louis loved his plays. He wasn't bothered with the nobles being upset with him. In his opinion, many of them very much deserved a little bit of mockery. And Molière was very wise never to say anything critical about the monarch. With the king's ear, Molière managed to convince Louis that the censors were wrong, and so he set about repurposing his work, taking things out, changing things, and a couple of weeks later he opened up another performance. But this time he charged double the price of admission, because hey, scandal sells, and it was a smash hit at the box office. It was a huge success, much to the chagrin of those who he lampooned. The comic warfare continued when Molière penned and performed L'École des Femmes, The School for Wives, in 1662. This came after a play called The School for Husbands. If you read Molière chronologically, which is a fantastic thing to do, you will see a difference when you get to this play, The School for Wives. It's his first seriously great work, and it is a sign of great things to come. We can see that Molière's aesthetic rise really begins here with this play. In The School for Wives, Molière presents a jealous character in the form of Arnulf, who wishes to marry Agnes, and she has been kept as his ward from a young age. In the play, we see Arnulf try to shelter Agnes and keep her ignorant, because he sees the refined and intelligent ladies of society as corrupt. To him, ignorance is bliss, and ignorance is virtue. And if you marry a simple woman, your chances of becoming a cuckold are reduced. Here's a wonderful little taster from that play, translated by Richard Wilbur. Arnulf says, "I know men who've undergone much pain because they married girls with too much brain. I want no intellectual, if you please, who'll talk of nothing but her Tuesday teas, who'll frame lush sentiments in prose and verse, and fill the house with wits and fops and worse, while I, as her dull husband, stand about like a poor saint whose candles have gone out. No, keep your smart ones, I've no taste for such. Women who versify know far too much. I want a wife whose thought is not sublime, who has no notion what it is to rhyme, and who indeed, if she were asked in some insipid parlour game what rhymes with drum, would answer in all innocence, a fife. In short, I want an unaccomplished wife, and there are 4 things only she must know, to say her prayers, love me, spin and sew." Molière played the character of Arnulf himself, and gossip circulated that Molière's own wife, Armande, had been unfaithful to him. Many saw Molière giving vent to his own personal relationship issues with his wife when Arnulf becomes increasingly desperate and distressed over the course of the play. And although The School for Wives would subsequently be regarded as a master work, it attracted a lot of criticism and sparked the protest known as the Quarrel of the School for Wives. Molière would respond to this in a beautifully meta-theatrical way with a play that imagined the spectators of this work, the ones who criticised his play, at a dinner after the performance. He called this the critique of the School for Wives, and he mocked them. A guerre comique, or war of comedy, ensued, and a bunch of different writers would take sides against Molière. Many in high society protested against the playwright's excessive realism and irreverence. Now, it's interesting because Molière's plays are not what we would call realism today. We might think that what they really meant by this was that Molière's satirical digs got too close to the bone. I'm reminded a little bit of Oscar Wilde's preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray, and indeed, if you like Wilde's high society comedies, like The Importance of Being Earnest, then you will love Molière. Wilde would say that the dislike dislike of realism is the rage of seeing one's own face in the glass. Molière unfortunately let a lot of the negative criticism, the abuse and the insults get to him. It didn't matter that audiences loved his comedies and that they were box office hits. As is so often the case, you don't listen to the hundreds or the thousands of people who love what you do, who praise your work. You only see the small handful who spitefully attack, often out of their own personal issues. The criticism that he got, however, must have fueled him, and I can imagine him writing with great gusto, glee and sadistic fun, as though he were going to war, because we see that he starts to ramp up the satire, he ramps up the social commentary with each new play, and after The School for Wives, his plays just got better and better. Now, the vitriolic attacks against Molière certainly didn't diminish when they found out that the king, who was actually godfather to Molière's child, so that gives you an idea of how close they were, they found out that the king had rewarded him with a pension. It was small, it was tokenistic, but it was still a sign of his favour when so many people wanted Molière to be disfavoured and they wanted to be in favour, not him. Tensions really came to a head when one of Molière's critics sent a denunciation of him to the king, saying that he had committed incest by marrying his daughter. Of course, this didn't exactly come out of nowhere, as Molière had originally been with the mother of the woman he was married to. Luckily, Molière was able to prove to Louis' satisfaction that this was not the case, but the vicious war ended up getting into Molière's body as well as his soul, and he started to get really ill. He developed a nasty cough, he got tuberculosis and had to battle that for years. He developed intense fatigue and his state of mind was thoroughly disoriented, and he ended up developing hypochondria. Because he was the consummate professional, however, Molière actually even used his coughs to punctuate his lines, and he kept in character, even though he was coughing and spluttering all over the place. And reading anecdotes of Molière's acting makes me wish that I had a time machine so that I could go back and see it firsthand. Apparently, he acted with his eyebrows, and to Molière, his gestures were as important as his words, and it was thought that no other actor was better when it came to rearranging their face. Now let's talk censorship and banning. The biggest scandal of Molière's career came when he put on the first performance of a play called Tartuffe. Tartuffe was performed at Versailles in 1664. There had been reconstruction of the palace, and to celebrate, Louis commissioned his orchestra to play so loud that people could hear the jubilation, the celebration right in the heart of Paris. The royal gardeners sculpted the hedges into beautiful flower ornaments, and they adorned the greenery. Chariots came in with actors dressed up like ancient gods. Indeed, Molière was dressed up as Apollo, and pyrotechnists orchestrated a lavish firework display of great beauty like never seen before. Molière composed a play with music from Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, another of the king's favourites, but he also saw this celebration as the perfect opportunity to put on a performance of a new work that he had been putting his heart and soul into, a work which depicted the hypocrisy of the religious authorities. The title character of Tartuffe is a liar, a swindler, a seducer of other men's wives, and a pious hypocrite. Although in later productions this danger to society was depicted as an imposter, as a fraudster, at first he was depicted as a member of the clergy, and his speeches overflowed with religious maxims and quotations from Holy Writ that were completely out of line from his deplorable actions. Molière put on a production of Tartuffe in front of the king, in front of the Queen Mother, who was very religiously devout, and courtiers, many of whom were members of the Society of the Holy Sacrament. They were zealous guarders of morality and religion in the country, and Molière basically mocked them right to their faces. The really funny thing about the first performance of Tartuffe was the fact that it was tolerated up until the third act. People weren't super warm to it, but it's when we get to the third act that a shocked silence fell over the theatre, and then violent outrage and outcries were thrown up. Molière delays introducing the title character, and when he finally comes on stage, that's when things get really biting. And the religious authorities in the audience then see that they are being lampooned in the form of this walking immorality. And of course there were many people who felt like they were being mocked in the form of the foolish character Orgone, who is completely taken in by Tartuffe. So Molière has gone after jealous husbands, he's gone after refined ladies in his previous plays, and now in Tartuffe he is going after religious hypocrisy. The character Orgone is blinded by admiration for Tartuffe, who tries to seduce his wife Elmire, despite the fact that Orgone is trying to get his daughter to marry Tartuffe, something she isn't happy about. Here's Tartuffe responding to his morality being questioned with some ludicrous, comic, reverse psychology. Yes, brother, I'm a wicked man, I fear. A wretched sinner, all depraved and twisted. The greatest villain that has ever existed. My life's one heap of crimes, which grows each minute. There's naught but foulness and corruption in it. And I perceive that heaven, outraged by me, has chosen this occasion to mortify me. Charge me with any deed you wish to name. I'll not defend myself, but take the blame. Believe what you are told, and drive Tartuffe, like some base criminal, from beneath your roof. Yes, drive me hence, and with a parting curse, I shan't protest, for I deserve far worse. After the play, an angry mob of religious authorities came to the king, including the Archbishop of Paris, who insisted that the king place an immediate ban on all performances of Tartuffe. The Society of the Holy Sacrament called Molière a dangerous writer, and such was the vehemence of this crowd that this was one of the few times that the king felt himself powerless to refuse those under him, and he had to tell Molière that his play was banned. Pierre Roule, a chief priest, handed the king a written work denouncing Molière as a demon in clothes and flesh, and calling for him to be burnt and consigned to the flames of hell. Now, Molière read this, and he begged for the king's protection. They didn't just want to kill his play, they wanted to kill him. The king despised this petition, and he refused the proposal completely. And he was also bemused. Why had they all jumped on Tartuffe when Scaramouche, the popular Italian character upon which Molière had modelled so many of his comic protagonists, said much the same things, but in an even more abrasive way? Apparently to this, Prince Conde, who was a defender of Tartuffe, said that the difference is that Scaramouche laughs at heaven and religion, about which these gentlemen don't give a damn, but in Tartuffe, Molière laughs at them. This is why they are so enraged. There's an important distinction to observe here. Molière's not going after religion, he's going after hypocrisy. It's always hypocrisy and self-delusion. It's always the pretense, not the thing itself, like with the precious ladies. He's mocking the fact that they aren't what they want people to think they are. Despite the banning of the play, distribution of it in written form didn't stop. And all over Europe, people wanted to read the play that had caused so much furore. And the French authorities had their work cut out for them when it came to stopping Tartuffe from sweeping through the lands. After Tartuffe, Molière had to come up with another play at the king's suggestion, so he went back to his study of Spanish legends and he dusted off the familiar tale of the seducer Don Juan, writing his version of the story, which, like Tartuffe, also sparked controversy and calls for banning. So Molière, getting sicker and sicker from the stress of it all, had two plays that were box office hits, and yet he wasn't allowed to perform them, and the rest of his repertoire wasn't bringing in anything like what those other plays were bringing in. And so Molière started to get depressed. He got more and more ill, and he got more and more jaded and cynical about the world, about society and human nature, and he became deeply misanthropic. And in 1666, Molière penned a new play, one that would be only modestly received, not causing much stir or excitement, but which would go on to be considered one of his masterpieces. The play was called Le Misanthrope. In this play, we have the extraordinary character of Alceste, and he is courting his love, Célimène. But he cannot stand the double standards in courtly society, the praising of a courtier's awful poem, the speaking flatteringly to everyone's faces, but meanly behind their backs, which is what Célimène does. She entertains all of her suitors and kind of leads them on, and then she lambasts them when they're not around, behind their backs in a very cruel fashion. And all the while, Alceste is the one who is scorned because he has the honesty to say the mean things directly to their faces. This is a play that speaks eternally to the misanthropic element in us all. Here's Alceste right at the beginning of the Misanthrope talking to Philinte. He says he despises these lavishers of meaningless embraces, these utterers of obliging commonplaces, who court and flatter everyone on earth, and praise the fool no less than the man of worth. Should you rejoice that someone fondles you, offers his love and service, swears to be true, and fills your ears with praises of your name, when to the first damned fop he'll say the same? No, no, no self-respecting heart would dream of prizing so promiscuous an esteem. However high the praise, there's nothing worse than sharing honours with the universe. Esteem is founded on comparison. To honour all men is to honour none. Since you embrace this indiscriminate vice, your friendship comes at far too cheap a price. I spurn the easy tribute of a heart, which will not set the worthy man apart. I choose, sir, to be chosen, and in fine, the friend of mankind is no friend of mine. So he's satirising sycophancy. If everything is praised and highly valued, then nothing means anything anymore. And this is not a contemporary concern. Society has always had this as an issue. When Philinte asks Alceste, must all poor human creatures be embraced without distinction by your vast distaste? Even in these bad times there are surely a few, and Alceste responds, no, I include all men in one dim view. Some men I hate for being rogues, the others I hate because they treat the rogues like brothers, and lacking a virtuous scorn for what is vile, receive the villain with a complacent smile. Alceste goes on to cause much trouble for himself when he tells a character called Oronte that his poem is really, really bad. This is a poem that everyone else praises to his face. Alceste has the honesty to tell him how awful it really is. And Alceste also has a problem with the fact that Célimène is entertaining all of her suitors when she's meant to be with him. Why can't you send them packing? You're not interested in them, are you? Is it my fault that all men pursue me, she says. Am I to blame if they're attracted to me? And when they gently beg an audience, ought I to take a stick and drive them hence? And Alceste says, Madam, there's no necessity for a stick. A less responsive heart would do the trick. Of your attractiveness I don't complain, but those your charms attracts you then detain by a most melting and receptive manner, and so enlist their hearts beneath your banner. It's the agreeable hopes which you excite that keep these lovers round you day and night. Were they less liberally smiled upon, that sighing troupe would very soon be gone. The Misanthrope was a flop. It didn't perform well at the box office, but it is rightly revered as one of Molière's masterpieces today. And whilst Molière penned this, and he continued penning other plays, for years he would petition to be allowed to perform Tartuffe again. He was reworking Tartuffe endlessly, altering the plot, adding characters to it in order to make it more acceptable. Now sadly today we don't have the original manuscript. That's a shame because it was clearly a lot more caustic than the Tartuffe we have now. But Molière would take the rewritten play on tour again in a different guise under the title of The Impostor. The box office responded and it was a huge success, but the Archbishop responded too, and he flagged up the fact that this old play was being ran under a new title. He called The Impostor a most pernicious comedy, which is all the more dangerous to religion in that, under the pretext of condemning hypocrisy and false piety, it gives encouragement to condemnation of those who manifest true piety as well. After years of fighting for his work, Molière felt defeated and he withdrew from high society and he hid himself in an attic in Auteuil with a stack of books, works from Plutarch, Ovid and Horace. Luckily, despair gave way to artistic productivity and more great plays burst from his pen. Plays like Amphitryon and The Miser. Finally, however, after years of despair and thwarted attempts, the king summoned Molière and told him that Tartuffe could finally be performed in 1669. And though Molière was much aged and visibly ill in the role of Orgone, it was once again a roaring success and dwarfed all the other plays in their repertoire that season. Towards the end of his life, Molière would put everything he knew about the theatre, everything he had learnt, into the comic masterpiece that is Les Femmes Savantes, or The Learned Ladies. But he became increasingly ill, and also the king's favour shifted to the composer Jean-Baptiste Lully. We see that Molière would unfortunately die at the young age of 51. His last play would be The Imaginary Invalid, Le Malade Imaginaire, or The Hypochondriac. Tragically, he collapsed on stage during a performance and was carried home to die. His last play was, like much of his output, a channeling of his own pain, his own personal tragedy channeled into comedic expression. All of his life, Molière had sought to bring dignity to the craft of comedy, and he achieved this. He spent his theatrical career in combat with the hypocrites of the time, and we might say that these hypocrites needed to pass away before Molière could get the esteem he rightly deserved in France. After he passed away, there was an explosion of popularity in regards to his dramas over in England. England's theatre scene had been shut down for a very long time, but with the Restoration, we see that audiences were absolutely lapping up Molière. It took a little bit longer before Molière got such popularity in his home country. But as time passed, Molière would have the last laugh because, of course, today he is studied, he is revered, he is honoured, indeed he's worshipped in literary and theatrical circles, and his social satires continue to be relevant. They continue to be joyful lambasting of elements of the human condition that we can all relate to. And if we don't take ourselves too seriously, his comedies can be curative, they can be medicinal, they can offer us a healing power. Now, if you're coming to Molière for the first time, I hope that has whetted your appetite for his genius comedies. If you would like to deep read some of his masterpieces with a great group, then we will be doing exactly that at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. For that lecture series and deep appreciation, I'm personally going to be working from the Richard Wilbur translation. And if you're looking for an outstanding translation of Molière, then the Richard Wilbur is highly recommended. There is a beautiful 2-volume set published by Library of America. You can see there's a red volume, this is volume 2, and it has 4 great plays, and then volume 1 has 6 splendid plays too. What's really great about this translation is, firstly, it's very faithful. It's faithful to the original French metre, insofar as that's possible in English. It's a real challenge. So much so that many translators of Molière have opted to translate him into prose, which I completely disagree with. I don't think Molière should be rendered in prose, except for the handful of plays like Don Juan, which are in French prose rather than verse, but you need to have that rhythm, you need to have those rhyming couplets. You lose an enormous amount of the effect and the power when that is removed, and Richard Wilbur does an extraordinary job of rendering Molière's rhymes into English. His choice of words is fantastic and alone causes a lot of humour. There's a lot of really unique rhyming going on in his translations, and one of the reasons why Richard Wilbur did such a great job is because he was a poet himself a great poet, great American poet. So many say that he is very, very faithful, and this 2-volume set collates all of his translations together, and not only does it do that, but there's a fantastic introductory essay, and each and every play in the set has a prefacing essay, which I think is really nice to read through once you've enjoyed the play. I'd like to quickly read you some of the foreword by Adam Gopnik in this edition. Miraculously theatrical in ways that more academic translations are not, Wilbur's Molière is nonetheless miraculously authentic to the original, written in a flowing, vigilantly smooth version of Molière's rhyming couplets, instead of in the lumpy prose of previous English translations. At once readable and stage-friendly, his translations achieve the improbable end of making 17th century French prosody completely playable in English, while remaining true to the essentials of French grand siècle style. What we're going to do at the Hardcore Literature Book Club read-through is we are going to begin our journey and our appreciation of Molière with a deep dive into Tartuffe. Let's begin with the play that caused the greatest scandal in Molière's playwriting career. We'll be talking about satire. We're going to talk about Louis the Sun King. We'll be talking about the religious authorities, and we'll be talking about censorship. After Tartuffe, we're going to have a special focus on the Misanthrope. We're going to deep dive into that, and we're going to talk about how Molière channeled his tragic impulses into comic masterpieces. And then we're going to have a comparative exercise that will be incredibly rewarding. We're going to read The School for Wives and The Learned Ladies up against each other. As I said, The School of Wives marks the real beginning of Molière's aesthetic rise, and The Learned Ladies many consider to be the masterpiece where he amalgamated everything he learnt over the course of his career. At the book club, we're going to read Molière's crowning achievements together, the works that are rightly considered to be his masterpieces, but we're also going to be making complimentary reading recommendations along the way. I'll be making references to many of his other plays, so you can tumble down those literary rabbit holes. I'll be making lots of recommendations for documentaries to watch, films to watch, recommendations about adaptations, and secondary reading to make your journey through Molière all the more rewarding. You can access those recommendations and the book club discussion and a huge back catalogue of lectures, read-throughs and bookish content that you can watch immediately on demand at patreon.com/hardcore literature. At time of recording at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, our next discussion will be midweek this coming week. So in a few days' time, we'll be talking about Shakespeare's King Lear as part of the Shakespeare Project. This is our chronological read-through of the complete works of Shakespeare, and as I've said before, you can jump on at the beginning at any time, or you can hop on where we are right now. At time of recording, we're working our way through the tragic procession, and King Lear is a very good one to start with. This weekend coming, we're going to be finishing off our deep reading of Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita. That's been a fantastic ride. The weekend after that concluding lecture for Bulgakov, we will have a special introductory lecture on Pride and Prejudice for Jane Austen, because if you know the schedule for the Hardcore Literature Book Club, you will know that we are very soon gearing up for our next big read, which will be Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. So our main and new bookish lectures for our live read-throughs come out on the weekends, and because we've got Bulgakov this week coming, and we've got an intro to Jane Austen the week after that, it will be the week after that that our discussion for Tartuffe goes live. So that means you've got a good few weeks to get a handle on that play, read it, watch a performance. Again, I will link performance recommendations in the body of this post at the book club. Linger over it, appreciate it, follow up the recommendations I make for secondary reading at the book club. I'm going to put a very specific film recommendation in that first post that I would highly recommend you enjoy before you read Tartuffe. Join our read-throughs, join our discussion, and you will be very warmly welcomed. Come share your passion for the great books with a seriously wonderful group of like-minded lovers of literature. And I'm going to end things there for today, but let us know your experience with Molière. Have you read or seen any performances of Molière before? If so, what do you make of the dramatist? What plays do you like? What do you think of his style, his tone, his stories, his characters? If you've never read a play by Molière or you've never seen a performance, what are you expecting and what would you like to get out of your first meeting with this comic genius? Thank you very much for watching today. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you and I hope you have a lovely day. Happy reading, everybody, and bye-bye for now.